By 1993, 1993, he decided to leave Arabia, and first he went to Afghanistan, back in Afghanistan, where he found that the civil war between the Afghans would not allow him to operate there. So he moved from there to the Sudan. Sudan at the time had espoused a policy of supporting revolutionary movements around the world. And there was a gentleman in the Sudan called Wahsn الترابي who had ambitions to make the Sudan the center of international revolutionary forces. And they managed to bring together in the Sudan the whole spectrum of revolutionary movements around the world for a meeting there to help coordinate their opposition to the neo-imperialist forces that they identified as being America and her supporters, not only in Europe and other elsewhere, but also in the Middle East. If you can imagine, people like the Tupumaros from Latin America, the Shining Path, the Red Army group from Japan, Bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda people, the Jihad group from Egypt, the Palestinian Marxist factions like the PFLP and the PFLP General Command, etc., etc. They all came together in Khartoum and were provided with sustenance and support by the Sudanese government at that time, including the famous Chacal, as the French call him, Carlos, who had been instrumental in hijacking OPEC oil ministers in the 70s. I don't know if you remember him or not. Maybe he was still not born at that time. But he was a very famous revolutionary Marxist originally from Venezuela, but brought his struggle against imperialism to the Middle East and used to work with the Red Brigades in Italy and the other European Marxist groups in the 70s in Europe, in Germany, and in France, and in other places. So Bin Laden was in the midst of all of these things, and his ideas, of course, were continually evolving into how to oppose the Zionist American conspiracy and those in the Middle East who, in his view, were in that league, and that included Saudi Arabia. The Sudan became, after 2 years of having all of these revolutionary groups in the Sudan, and there was pressure being put on them. America put the Sudan on its terrorist list of countries supporting terrorism and sanctioning them, and eventually the United Nations itself sanctioned Sudan. So the Sudanese began to try to rid themselves of these groups. And one of the things they did was they handed over Carlos to the French because he had committed a terrorist act in Paris and he was on their wanted list in Paris. So Carlos is now still in jail in France. Bin Laden was offered to Saudi Arabia by the then president of the Sudan, but he put a condition on releasing him to Saudi Arabia. This is in 1995 or so. And that condition was that Saudi Arabia would not prosecute him. And of course, the leadership here said, no way, nobody here is above the law. So if you're going to give him to us, we're going to take him to court, because he had already committed terrorist acts in the kingdom in 1995, particularly. here in Riyadh with the explosion of a car bomb in front of one of the National Guard buildings in the center of Riyadh. So he was wanted here for that act. And bin Laden, having felt that the Sudanese government wanted to get rid of him, he took off from there and went back to Afghanistan, where he sought refuge with some of his old friends from jihad, mujahideen days against the Soviets in Afghanistan. In the meantime, in Afghanistan itself, the civil war was coming to a climax with the new introduction of a new element in Afghanistan, other than the mujahideen forces at that time, and this new element was called the Taliban. The Taliban grew out of the mujahideen forces, but they were not beholden to any of the mujahideen leaders, either in Pakistan or in Afghanistan. And they developed their own momentum and spread their influence in Afghanistan to the extent where by 1996 and early 1997 they managed to control nearly, I would say, 80% of Afghanistan, with just a small enclave of opponents in the northeast opposing them. They occupied the capital and other places in Afghanistan, and began to seek international recognition. The kingdom offered them recognition, not only in order because they controlled most of Afghanistan and the capital, but also to keep in touch with what is happening in Afghanistan. And the Taliban, at that time, were very friendly to Saudi Arabia, but by occupying all of Afghanistan, they also inherited the presence of bin Laden from one of the mujahideen groups that had given him refuge in 1996 when he left Sudan. And in that issue, of course, the kingdom warned the Taliban that bin Laden is wanted here, and if they wanted to give him refuge, then they must make sure that he doesn't do anything against the kingdom. And they gave us assurances that they would do that. Unfortunately, he kept on operating against the kingdom, and we kept on pressing the Taliban to stop from doing harm to the kingdom, either in media or actually in supporting terrorist acts and trying to smuggle weapons and other dangerous things into the kingdom. By 1998, his opposition to the kingdom was so flagrantly open that, and the Taliban had not kept their word to us to keep him from operating against us. I was sent by the king to meet with the then leader of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, to convince him to hand over bin Laden to us. So in June 1998, I went to Kandahar, met with Mullah Omar, who, as I mentioned, at that time the Taliban were very friendly to Saudi Arabia, received me graciously, and we reached an agreement that we would set up a joint committee between the Taliban and the kingdom to look into the judicial issues of their releasing bin Laden to us, because they had given him refuge before that. And this committee was supposed to meet soon after I left Afghanistan and decide on that issue. By July 1998, Mullah Omar sent an envoy to assure our leadership that he was working on setting up this committee, and we told him we're ready anytime that they are. In August of that year, the embassy bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam took place, U.S. embassy bombings. And they were clearly bin Laden acts. And so then President Clinton issued an ultimatum to the Taliban: you deliver bin Laden or we're going to take action. The Taliban insisted that they have to go through a judicial process of proving that bin Laden did the deed and so on. Clinton being under investigation at the time and the threat of being thrown out of the White House by the Republicans at that time, he decided to take action against the Taliban and sent missiles and so on to bomb Kandahar, where bin Laden had his camp. Of course, bin Laden was nowhere in that camp at that time because the Americans had already, said we're going to do that. So he survived the bombing. But for us, of course, it complicated the issue of the Taliban. And so in September of that year, I was sent back to Kandahar to remind Mr. Mullah Omar of his promise to set up the committee to deliver bin Laden to us. And when I went there this time, Mullah Omar was a different person. He was not so gracious. He was very, very abrasive in his talk and telling me that we shouldn't prosecute this man who is under threat by American military force, etc. Instead of prosecuting him and persecuting him, you should work with him to oppose the imperialist Americans and so on, etc. So I simply got up and said, Mr. Omar, what you are doing is going to bring harm, not just to you personally, but it's going to bring harm to Afghanistan. And I said, I'm going to leave now, and when I go home, I'm going to recommend that we break relations with you, and you will have to suffer the consequences of your actions. Unfortunately, they never delivered bin Laden to us, so we broke relations with them, and ever since that time, the Taliban have been on our blacklist because of their support for al-Qaeda. This is a historical background. I hope I didn't take too long in explaining it.